Awesome. So pumped to be with my friend Lydia today. How are you, Lydia?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm so psyched to dive in. We connected through this place, Hustle Fund. We had this like incredible first conversation, but just as maybe a primer, when somebody asks, and I hate this question, so it's like so funny I open with it, but when someone asks you like, "What do you do?" How do you respond?
I say I change lives. Um, I change lives currently in two ways. I hire people usually for their first career in sales because I oversee a sales development team, which is typically the entry level job. And I love that part of my job, and I always have because it's many people's ticket into the middle class. You don't have
Mm,
to have a 4-year college degree to be incredibly successful in sales. You don't have to be well connected if you're selling a strong, valuable product. You don't have to have family connections. And that is the privilege of my life. And the current product that I support my sales team in selling right now is in education. And what we do is we provide college counseling in a team based approach to high school students, grad students, transfer students, and even middle schoolers. And we essentially give them prep school insight into elite college admissions at a
mm.
tiny fraction of the cost. And I say that having learned so much about the college admissions process in the 6 months that I've been here. It's extraordinary.
That is so cool. And I love the sort of sticker that you put on that around sort of changing lives. Um, What do you look for when you're I know we're like off script already, right? But like, what do you look for when you're hiring good salespeople, or like, what are the attributes you're looking? What are the types of questions that you're asking to really sort of get at, hey, is this person going to be a fit?
Two things. One is goal orientation.
Mm.
Most people like people. I think that is probably 75% of the population. The number of people who approach improvement with no ego, they always want to get better in the service of their goals. That's actually a much rarer quality.
Mm.
And so I always ask what motivates people, why sales? And a great answer is because I'm goal oriented, because I want my effort and my skills to be reflected in my income, because I love getting better, because I enjoy the container of having a monthly quota. The second thing is relentless curiosity.
Mm.
Among the people who are goal oriented, having that deep curiosity about people and the world around them is even rarer.
Mm.
So I look for people who are have passionate hobbies. I look for people who do research when I ask them what questions they have for me at the end of the interview and ask me something interesting. I look for people who dig into the responses I give when they ask questions with more questions. That blows me away every time.
That is so cool. That curiosity one is one I've never, I mean, it makes all the sense in the world, right? But it's not one that you immediately sort of think of when you think of sales. But that makes all of the sense, right?
I think it certainly helps people if you are selling any kind of a product at a company, there are going to be contours to what you're selling, and you're going to end up having many similar conversations over the course of your tenure at that company. The trap that people fall into if they're not objectively curious is everybody starts to sound the same. They jump to conclusions, they stop listening, people stop experiencing themselves as being heard.
Mm.
And even if the solution is still ideal for that person, when people don't feel uniquely heard and understood, they don't respond the same way and they're less likely to buy.
Yeah, that makes all the sense. Um, what lessons have you learned from doing this for quite some time around and being somewhat sort of or pretty seasoned in this profession and having some accomplishments where you grew like massive amount of sort of sales pipelines? What are the top takeaways that you have like many years into the
Mm.
space?
when I talk to people about a career in sales, I think what most people have to figure out the hard way is that building a long-term career in sales requires you, the salesperson, to enter interview conversations or conversations about new opportunities at new companies like an investor
Hmm.
and not like a entry-level candidate who just needs a job. Once you have a network, industry understanding, and sales acumen, you become very valuable. And most people I know, including me, had to figure out the hard way that if you have those things, companies will try to sell you on coming and working for them because you're working on variables, so it's not the biggest risk for them.
Hmm.
And you have to be skeptical, you have to do back channels, you have to approach it almost like you would if you were about to invest in that company as a venture capitalist or as a private equity investor. And that's a big shift for people coming out of like early career where really you just need the experience, you need someone to train and develop you. At a certain point in my career, probably 8 or 9 years in, I became the person with value and I had to approach um, moving jobs with the same care, perhaps more care than I would if I was investing in the company because I can only invest in one company at a time. So if a venture capitalist can invest in, on the low end, 10 companies a year and at the high end, 300 companies a year, think about the degree of thought and consideration you have to put into the market, the timing, the leadership, the product integrity, the customer base, if you have one investment that you can make every 3 years.
Mm. That is an incredible mental framework that you just said, thinking like an investor for each decision, and so powerful and so smart. And how many people actually really sort of do that, right? It's like you're working from a place of frustration or the corporate politics or whatever is that's sort of like driving you crazy about this place that you're working. um, what are the questions that you're asking or that you're thinking about when you're sort of making this investment decision? Because you're right, that's massive, right? It's like I'm going to be at this one place, and I'm essentially marrying professionally this place for the next however long. What are the questions that you're thinking of or that are top of mind?
I think it's one of those things that's simple but not easy, right? Like the questions themselves are quite easy. It's what percentage of your team is at or exceeding goal? And you should
Hmm.
hear 70% or above. When you look at your immediate manager's background and you look at the CEO's leadership, have they done this before? Or have they achieved something extraordinary in their own personal realm? Or are they a first time founder? And then are you going to dig into their customer base, start calling customers that they have listed on their website as referrals and seeing how they still feel about the product? Are you willing to go on LinkedIn, get LinkedIn recruiter, see who's left the company and reach out to them to see what their experience was like and why they left? What is their, if you're selling SaaS, what does their retention numbers look like? What does their lifetime customer value over customer acquisition cost look like? All those things which any decent company will provide you in the interview process. The hard part is walking away from a company that checks most but not all of those boxes and being selective. That is the hard part because as salespeople, first of all, everybody wants to be employed. It's, I think, in America, a huge part of our identity is the careers we have and the titles we have. And second of all, um, as salespeople, when people are selling to us, it's flattering, it is intoxicating. We want to believe that even though their customer acquisition cost is 9 times their lifetime customer value, they are going to figure that out and they are going to get it under control. And even though that plan doesn't really make sense to me, I want to believe like it is that mental discipline to
Yeah.
hold yourself to the rules that you set when you're starting the job search.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much of that is like using like intuition versus like sort of like using the the intelligence, right? That sort of like second and third order thinking. Like, how do you balance those two? Because I feel like that like you have that instinct, and then but like you're sort of rationing it through, and you're sort of like thinking through, you're spreading it out, whatever. Like, how do you balance those two things with that? Because there is this like, I'm always so fascinated on how people sort of like work between those two aspects, when you're making such a key and important decision.
I wish I could say intuition had something to do with it, but I've actually had to tune out my intuition in this
Mm.
particular field because I have such a strong optimism bias.
Yeah,
I believe people, and
totally.
I certainly have been wrong. Like, there have been companies that had a number of red flags. I walked away from them, and then they ended up doing exactly what they said, which was addressing that stuff and becoming very successful, but it was maybe 1 out of 100 conversations I've had.
Mm.
So, I've just learned my intuition tells me to fall in love with every company I talk to and say yes and throw myself in full force, and I have to surrender to the data, and I have to surrender to the experiences of people who, have been generous enough to authentically share about their own career mistakes with me
Mm.
and listen to them and apply those lessons, right? So, like, I'm part of a community called Pavilion where I heard from a number of sales leaders about going to pre-seed companies where it was a first-time founder. And I had to surrender to them and just say, "Hey, you know what? This so rarely works out. I am not gonna assume that I'm gonna be different." Right?
Yeah, that's incredible that you're able to sort of apply lessons not from your own experience, but from mentors, and being able to sort of see like, okay, here are the sort of signposts or these things that are sort of happening. Though I haven't experienced that, here's what I want to look out for. One thing I'm super curious about, because you've in your when you were at Go Guardian, and you drove like a 300% increase in pipeline sales. I think it was like 11 to 33 million ARR in like super short time span, like 36 months. If you had 1 hour to teach somebody how to sell, where would you focus?
I would focus on who the customer is. So it's actually pretty simple. I feel like everybody runs into this. They're very aware of the problem they're solving and they talk about it in generalities, right? So, for example, I have an automation software. It makes accounts payable super fast, and you can automate something that would take you 20 minutes in 20 seconds, right? And so people's initial instinct is to send out that communication, right? Whether it's over the phone or over email. And you actually have to take a step back. And instead of talking about the features and benefits of your own product as they exist in your product, you have to reframe that in the lives or the life or experience of your customers. So it would be, how much overtime are you paying your accounting staff at the end of the month? Saw that you have a new job opening. You already hired 6 people. Uh, there's been a lot of turnover on your team. Have you considered re-examining your workflow to see if you
Mhm.
can't do more with your existing team? And essentially thinking about what are the top 2 or 3 priorities to the person you're selling, and understanding that it is probably not simply saving time out of their day, right? I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and is like, "How can I save 20 minutes each day?" Right? They wake up and think, "How do I hold on to my job? How do I impress my boss? How do I hit the number this month? Do I let go of this person or do I keep this person? Um, how do I complete this complex task that's never been completed before but needs to be done before the board meeting?" Like, these are the thoughts that occupy your potential customers. They really don't wake up thinking about the specific niche that most people's products, address.
Completely. Completely. How about if you had a month? Like, how would that sort of training differ, or where would your sort of focus? Because I love that sort of like refocusing on the person, and that framing. If you had a little bit more time, like what would, and, having sort of done this before, how would that maybe differ?
Hmm. If I have a month with somebody, um, the first week is going to be dedicated to making that shift and really getting to know your customers in the big picture, right? What are the
Mhm.
actual things that occupy their brains, and how do you sound as credible as possible to them, right? What's the lingo? What are what are all the sort of dog whistles that people listen to make sure that you are actually of their world? And then for the remaining 3 weeks, we would break it down into how do you set an agenda for a call? How do you
Mhm.
conduct good discovery? And what do next steps look like? So it is that process part of sales that just takes practice, because
Mm.
if I'm role playing with you, I am gonna give you, for lack of a better word, I'm gonna give you softballs. But what
Yeah,
people actually say on a sales call astounds and amazes everyone every time. It's just the definition of, left field questions and left field responses.
completely. Yeah. Um, would you would you sort of during that time, would you be throwing them in the mix and sort of like not just sort of having them, would you put them in sort of like live calls or find like some easier customers? Like, would you get them reps doing that? Or would you sort of spend more time actually just in terms of sort of like building confidence, like scenario planning? Like, how would you sort of design it to sort of like fit that?
I think like the first week you can do role plays, you can listen to people, you can get the flow and the concept. This is assuming that you're not doing founder led sales, you're coming in as an
Hmm.
outside rep to a company. But after that, you have to start engaging with the weird and wild things that people say on real calls.
Completely. That makes all the sense. And somebody that's relatively new to sales, I couldn't relate to that more. The questions that are sort of coming out are left field and just all over the place because you never know the sort of individual experiences or day that somebody's sort of having or where their priorities are or these really sort of weird personality quirks that they're sort of dealing with like on their team or the person
Mhm.
above them or the board like there's all these sort of factors that you're not thinking about like, or sort of like
Yeah.
in your sort of framework that are inevitably going to sort of inform decisions and questions and things that people are thinking about and that interesting sort of balance of like you're trying to sort of not push them in a sort of direction, but you've got a specific sort of product or solution or range of things that you have. This person is coming from a very, very different place. And like how you're sort of like herding the cats in a certain direction is like not an easy thing.
Yes. Yes. And it's so funny, when I try to do role plays, even when I try to bring in the quirks or the personality dynamics on a team and incorporate that into the role play, I end up alluding to it way too explicitly, right? If somebody is, fairly confident that their boss is gonna be fired in the next week, they're not gonna tell a random vendor. What are all the ways that people allude to that kind of leadership, that upcoming leadership change that they anticipate without saying it? I mean, you almost have to read the transcripts of real sales calls to capture that.
Mm. Yeah. And how do you train them or so yourself in terms of like sort of sussing that out or like asking the right questions or that type of thing? Like, how do you approach that?
I think the ability to pull transcripts is the biggest game changer that's happened over the
Mhm.
last 5 or 6 years in sales. There's a million tools that do this. It gets me out of interpretation and synthesis and abstraction when I'm training a rep and into, let me actually say verbatim things that people have said in the last week on a call to you
Mhm.
and see how you respond.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense and like a really helpful insight too. And you're making me sort of want to reread some transcripts myself and just sort of see like, oh, okay, like this one didn't maybe go as smoothly as you could. So how would you sort of rethink that? Um, Last time we talked, we some really sort of fascinating things that we sort of talked on in the career space and in the the wealth generation spaces as well. Um, when you think about things that you've done in your career that have had like a force multiplier effect, right? Like, so Naval Ralph Kahn talks about this idea of leverage and building career leverage and life leverage and all these things by solving problems or sort of doing things that have a sort of multiplier kind of effect, right? So building an audience or solving a problem with code or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What things have you done in your career that you have found have had a little bit of like that force multiplier effect and carried from one job to the next?
I think the biggest shortcut I have access to now in my mid-career is a network of a small number of small, smart, thoughtful people. And the amount of time and effort these conversations that I've had with people in my network have saved is unfathomable, right? When I get an opportunity to interview or to invest in an education company, I have 3 or 4 people that still work in K-12 administration that I can reach out to, send them the link and say, "What do you think of this company?" And they will come to me with feedback I never anticipated, like, "Oh, the funding for this is about to get cut in my state,"
Wow.
or "This is huge. They just passed a bill here, but I don't like how they approached this problem, and here's why." And then there's people, when I've been on the job market, there is the small number of people that I feel like have not necessarily recruiters, but highly connected founders or highly connected um, executives that have access to most of the jobs, right?
Mhm.
Or an outsized number of opportunities. And all I have to do is call them, and suddenly I'm interviewing at 4 places.
Wow.
Or if I am considering different, if I'm considering a problem, I can talk to honestly, I love vendors for this or agencies. Like, agencies are amazing. So I try to make friends with people who run agencies, and I can say, "Hey, I'm trying to get this data set, or I'm trying to automate this. Is it even possible? What tech would you explore?" And having a personal relationship with those people, like, it doesn't matter if I give them their business or if I give them our business, they will give me the straight truth and save me a lot of time and effort talking to a dozen different vendors or exploring a dozen different things that they have seen their own clients try and fail.
Incredible answer. Couldn't agree more. I mean, the power of the network, and it's so much more than sort of access to opportunities and like the hidden job market and all of this stuff. It's like massive shortcuts to being more efficient in your job. It's intel that you're just not going to get in any other space, and particularly in your space. My guess would be that so much. There's so many sort of odd quirks around like working in the sort of niche of like venture capital and education and technology that makes it really, really sort of tricky to sort of like know, okay, here's the sort of public facing presence of this company, or I know these kind of people here, versus like getting that sort of inside scoop. My guess is there's a ton of things in the middle there that you just can't find without that network.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I wish that the internet had all the answers to obscure and incredibly specific questions, but we are not there yet.
Yeah. What are some of those incredibly like weird questions that that you're sort of like thinking on or that are going to have like an outsized effect on what you're considering with sort of going to that kind of company?
Oh, yeah. Um, I wanna make sure I understood the question. What are some of the questions that are gonna have an effect if I'm going to a company? So talking about job
Yeah,
market, job search.
exactly.
I think K-12 is just like any vertical, it has its own things, right? It has its own trends, it has its own, um, fads that are gonna last, it has trends that are gonna have some grip to them. There's the perennial things, and then there's, um services that are really strongly entrenched, right? Like I might see a lot of room to improve Salesforce, but if I am starting a company, I'm probably not going to go after Salesforce and existing Salesforce customers because that product is so entrenched in the organizations that use it. And so with K-12, I think about, and again, even if I follow Ed Week or any of these industry publications, their coverage is going to be about 10 to 20% removed from reality. It's just the
Mm.
reality of having journalists cover your industry versus talking about your industry with your peers at a conference. Um, and then I think the other thing about K-12 is that there is so much that is not only state level, but regional within the state, because in America, it is, local property taxes that fund a great proportion of our schools, depending on the district. Um, it really helps to know people who fit the ideal customer profile of the product that this K-12 company is going to be selling. Like,
Mm.
if you're selling speech therapy software, um, there is a special ed component to almost every public school district in the country. Who have they already sold to? Do they think they can sell more? And then I'll get on the phone with somebody who more or less matches that profile, whether it is a sort of mid-sized suburban district, a very small rural district without access to the same kind of talent market, or an urban district in an expensive area where, talent, the price of talent is just too dear. Um,
Mm.
and I'll talk through, do you have this problem? Would you go with this vendor to address this problem? Why or why not? And I wish there were Reddit threads on, um, the ins and outs of addressing a speech therapist hiring deficit at every school in America, but there just isn't. But if that's the problem that a founder is trying to solve, I need to dig in and figure out as much as I can about that landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. And what are the cues for like really good discovery questions? Because my sense is you're really good at this. Like, what are the second, third, fourth sort of follow up questions that you're sort of like thinking on, or how are you tapping that curiosity to ask things that are going to surface insights that go beyond, right? Like just the the Reddit thread or the sort of the simple thing. Like, how are you thinking and approaching that?
Mm. When I'm evaluating a job, especially in K-12 or education, I'll reach out to people in the ideal customer profile. Um, I'll share about it. I'll ask them if they're interested. And 80% of the time they say no, thank you, just statistically. So then it's about having a wide enough network that you can ask 3, 4, 5 people. And if it's a good product, at least 1 or 2 of them will be interested or be using something similar already. So
Mm.
there's that. And it goes back to the simple but not easy thing. A lot of times I love the founder. The founders are startup founders tend to be very charismatic. Um, and so I want to believe, but I hear from too many people that it's not of interest. And then for the people that say it's of interest, I'll say, okay, do you want me to introduce you to the founder?
Mm.
And that tells me if they're willing to put their money where their mouth is and dedicate some time to talking to this person.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not necessarily about asking the craftiest questions. It's just being willing to put people's feet to the fire and seeing if their actions line up with their words, because that is what tells me a product is truly interesting and truly solving an urgent problem. Is if people are like, yes, absolutely, let's get this show on the road. I will actually enter a buying conversation with this person because you told me about it.
Yeah, there's a massive amount of space between those two things, right? It's saying or signaling that you're sort of interested in something versus actually putting your money down. There's miles apart
Totally.
there. Yeah. So in this like hyper interesting space that you're sort of working in, where you're at this sort of intersection of K through 12 and college admissions and all these other sort of fascinating worlds in the sort of venture spaces um, and technology and whatnot. In that sort of admissions and education space, if you could rethink how admissions process is working, or you're going to sort of work in a sort of advisory capacity for colleges for just simplifying the admissions process or making it more user centric, how would you approach that?
Hmm. This is a tough one for a number of reasons, but I think it would make the biggest difference because it is the biggest eye opener. Um, I would release 20 profiles of accepted students
Hmm.
that are pretty representative. They have the average grade GPA, they have the average SAT score. What do their extracurriculars look like? Where were they ranked in terms of their class? And I would release that for every college in America, right? Because I think when people say, and the problem is, again, like, a lot of college rankings are determined by how many students they reject. So there's not an incentive to make it
Totally.
really transparent, because you don't want to scare people. There's a perverse incentive. You don't want to scare people off from applying to Harvard because that would impact their rating. Um, but it would make a huge difference, right? Because you can see, I think the biggest thing that people struggle with is the extracurricular, especially for people who didn't apply to college in the US themselves, the extracurricular piece. They don't
Yeah.
realize that grades are still 50% of the student's total package. So, and they don't realize what having less than stellar grades requires
Hmm.
in terms of extracurriculars. If you are a 3.6 and you're applying to Harvard, you have to have qualified for the Olympics. That is the kind of extracurricular achievement that they are looking for to compensate for that. And so I think just showing people just average student profiles with as much detail as possible of the students that they typically admit would clear a lot of that stuff up if, people were willing to accept a sometimes unpleasant truth.
I love that idea. It is this sort of like weird black box thing that you have, and there's, I think, incredible sort of subjectivity like that, that happens at that sort of level that makes it sort of seemingly random for the person that's applying to all these sort of different schools and being like, okay, well, my grades match up here, here, and here. My extracurricular sort of maps this profile that I'm sort of seeing that all these places are asking for, but I got in here, 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 these better ranked ones, not here, here, and I have no idea why.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if we had an index of like 400 kids complete profiles and all the schools they applied to and where they were rejected, waitlisted, and admitted, that would accomplish the same thing.
Yeah. How do you all sort of like engineer on your end, like the hurdles that you have to sort of like face on that process, right? Because when you're sort of dealing with this sort of black box and you're sort of working to sort of help students sort of shepherd them through like a very complicated and challenging process, how are you all sort of like working that to sort of put the students in the best position they possibly can?
I mean, the first thing is it really helps that we actually have access to, like, because we work with about 2 to 3,000 students a year, and we know exactly what their backgrounds are and where they were waitlisted, accepted, and rejected. So we have the 400 kids that I just
Yeah.
described and then some. That really, really helps. And that's why having that kind of team-based approach is incredibly valuable. Um, I think in terms of approaching the black box, I hate to say it, but I think the answer now is applying to more schools with the same level of uh, focus and detail orientation on each application. So fundamentally investing more time in it. I think over the past 10 years, the average number for students that are applying to highly selective schools, so top 50, the average number of applications has gone from 7 to
Mhm.
15.
Wow.
It's just taking more time. And that's not, I don't think that's great for students, but it is the reality of it now.
Completely. Completely. And there's so many sort of trends that are sort of underscoring that too, where you've got sort of a rich get richer kind of phenomenon, right? Where elite
Yes,
schools are
flight
just
to
sort of pulling
quality
more.
for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah,
completely.
and I mean, I cannot blame families for that because it BU just crossed $90,000 for living expenses and tuition. I mean, the investment that people are required to make to attend these schools is only getting greater and greater. So why would you pay, um, I mean, really for a house, the equivalent of
Yeah.
a house, to send your student somewhere that you don't know if the ROI is going to be as strong as just buying them a house?
Completely. Completely. H- if you're thinking about this sort of K through 12 world, that's essentially sort of pushing so many students like towards this sort of college space, how do you think about sort of tweaking that or like reworking that, given everything that you sort of know, working this sort of corporate world and training and building incredible sales teams and all of that? Like, how would you approach sort of like better preparing students for a very changing world at that sort of K through 12 level?
Hmm.
It's a loaded one, and you're sitting at the intersection of like all these interesting spaces. So I'm so curious on how you think about that, just given the spaces that you're inhabiting.
Yeah. Um, I think it's 2 things, right? Which is, I think, in the immediate, if I could just do one thing for every student in America that already has like a 3.8 GPA and above a 1400 on the SAT, like right now today, I would give them a book of all the competitions that really matter for selective institutions, because that is,
Mm,
when I mentioned we give people insight into the prep school admissions landscape at a tiny fraction of the cost. That's what I'm talking about. Is there are things like the American Mathematics Competition or the Concord Review that are so essentially there's some gatekeeping,
mm,
right? Most people have never heard of the Concord Review, but if you attend Phillips Andover, your teachers know all about it, right? Um, so that would be the quickest and easiest thing. I mean, I think broadly for the broadest swath of students and for a longer time horizon, I would probably push students to engage more with adults
mm,
whatever that looks like, to start building their professional network with adults and employers sooner. There was a time when a degree in computer science was enough to get you a six-figure job upon graduation. I think that time has come and gone for the majority of schools. And so your ability to get internships and get great jobs afterwards really depends on your ability to build a network, and start uh, connecting with people at a personal level.
yeah, that's a incredible and awesome answer. And yeah, I think networking is one of those things that people talk about, and
Simple but not easy, right?
yeah, and and it's funny too because like my personal thing is I think it sounds very like formal and like sort of like transactional, and in like my experience, it's incredibly relational and fun, right? And it's like not this like
Yes.
right. There's this like this funny intersection of like friendship and genuine relationships that like also happens with business transactions that like I don't know if it's sort of talked about or explored when people just sort of say networking.
And, if I'm a high school student, it really comes down to having confident and poised conversations with adults. You don't have to get
Yeah.
diddly do out of them, but you just have to have the confidence and poise to speak to them essentially as a peer, and that'll get you 90% of the way there.
Yeah. Great advice. This has been awesome. Maybe as a closing question, it's a crazy time to alive. There's lots of things that are happening. Like, what excites you about what's sort of the technology trends or things that we're sort of seeing in the world and space right now, and what's maybe a little bit scary?
That is a great question. Um, I think what excites me most, and it's not even the things that I'm most intimately plugged into, like K-12, is, um, just the amount of, climate tech and, um, I just think I just love seeing that kind of innovation, on the biotech side with lab grown meat is getting cheaper every single year, and energy grids are getting smarter slowly over time. And that excites me because it benefits pretty much anyone who lives in a city on the electrical grid, or has the potential to impact them positively. And what scares me? Not a lot. I have the sort of naive view that the pendulum of humanity swings towards justice most of the time.
Hmm.
Um, I think if anything scares me, it is um, it's very short term. I think there's a lot of kids, young kids, I'd say like early career people that are interested in working in tech, but it's a fundamentally different landscape than it was in 2021 just because of the
Hmm.
flow of private market capital. And I don't know if it scares me, but it would be unfortunate if those students, those young people, that next generation of talent radically redirected their focus away from tech just because
Hmm.
of short-term industry conditions that are bound to change when interest rates go back down.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense and really, really insightful. Well, Lydia, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. It was great. Where can people find you and connect and all that good kind of stuff?
Find me on LinkedIn. Absolutely the best place to connect with me, Lydia Winn at Empowerly. Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.